The history of the ancient world was the history of the Mediterranean, the inland sea. The history of the modern world is the history of life round the Atlantic. This is the story of Atlantic Empire. 500 years ago, the only known part of the Atlantic seaboard was the part round Europe. The Christian nations of Europe were hemmed in on the east by the forces of Islam. In 1453, when Constantinople fell, Christendom was cut off from Asia. The Europeans therefore looked westward for an outlet. The Portuguese voyaged down the African coast. Eventually they rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached Asia by the southeast route, which has been used ever since. The Europeans of that day believed that Asia lay westwards, directly on the other side of the Atlantic at a not very great distance. In this belief, Columbus set sail under the flag of Isabella, Queen of Spain, and on his first voyage reached unknown islands, which he believed to be the fringe of Asia, and which he therefore named the Indies. From Bristol, the Genoese Cabot sailed for the King of England and discovered Newfoundland and the lands round the mouth of the St. Lawrence. Amerigo Vespucci also sailed under the Spanish flag and discovered the coastline of what appeared to him a continent, and which was called after him America. It was now clear that the new discoveries could not be Asia, but must be part of a new world. During the next century, the coastline of the New World which blocked the way to Asia was largely revealed. The most important voyage was that of Drake in the Golden Hind. He discovered the west coast of America before sailing round the globe across the Pacific Ocean, which separated the west of the New World from the east of the Old. The 17th century saw the explorer and adventurer give way to the settler. Typical of the settlers is the ship of the Pilgrim Fathers, the Mayflower. The Atlantic nations, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the English, and the French and the Dutch, now settled colonies in America and trading posts in Africa. These were the Spanish possessions, marked with black and white lines. These were the Portuguese Atlantic countries, shown in waving lines. These were the British settlements, indicated in white. This was the French Empire, marked with black lines, and these were the Dutch possessions, pointed out by arrows. In the 18th century, the period of settlement developed into a great period of trade expansion. Now the Atlantic trade routes were established, especially the English Atlantic routes. Codfish, furs, and whale oil were carried from Newfoundland and the north to England. England sent emigrants and manufactured goods to New England, and she received in return naval stores, tar and cordage. Tobacco, rice, tar, and cotton came to England from her southern colonies in return for emigrants and goods. There was a three-sided trade with the West Indies, which produced sugar and rum raised by slave labor. The slaves came from West Africa, which also produced gold. Britain sent manufactured goods, guns, beads, and spirits to West Africa. So goods went round between Great Britain, West Africa, and the West Indies. But the New Englanders also took part in this trade, competing with the mother country. They sent corn and timber to the West Indies in return for rum and sugar, and took rum and tobacco to West Africa in return for slaves. Apart from these routes, the dominating trade of the Atlantic was the slave trade. Such was in outline the history of the Atlantic until the modern history of that ocean starts in 1763 with the decisive defeat of France by Great Britain. The old British colonial empire of this date is marked white on the map. But soon after this date, the 13 American colonies revolted against Britain and became independent as the United States of America. They were supported by the French, and early in the war, the French fleet cut off Great Britain from America. Thus, Britain failed and lost the greater part of the old empire because temporarily she was no longer the supreme naval power in the Atlantic. But before the war ended, in a naval action here in the West Indies, Rodney defeated the French fleet at the Battle of the Saints. By this battle, Great Britain regained naval supremacy in the Atlantic, and she has never lost it since. After the year 1789, all Europe was convulsed by the French Revolutionary Wars and then by the Napoleonic Wars. But because of her naval power during this period, British trade along Atlantic sea routes went on practically undisturbed. The solid lines mark the sea communications between France and her Atlantic colonial empire, between Holland and hers, and between Spain and her South American possessions. These communications were all wiped out by the British Navy during the war years. Because of this, when peace was restored in 1815, there were many changes around the Atlantic. The French, whose possessions are marked with white hatching, had lost many islands in the West Indies and then sold the huge district of Louisiana to the United States. The Dutch, whose empire around the Atlantic is being lit up now, never recovered the Cape of Good Hope which the British had taken when Holland was controlled by Napoleon. This was the beginning of British South Africa. The Portuguese colonies included Brazil, now being marked in South America. The Spanish colonies in Central and South America are marked with straight black and white stripes. These colonies and Brazil had been cut off from Europe by the wars for so long that they declared themselves independent of their home countries. They became republics supported by the United States and Great Britain, though for a time Brazil was governed independently by a member of the Portuguese royal family. Now, for the first time, the United States put forward the Monroe Doctrine, that the American continent was not to be the scene of further European conquest. But the practical success of this doctrine depended entirely on British naval support, which cut off America from European interference. Thus protected from the political ambitions of European powers, the South and Central American states developed rapidly, largely helped by British policy and enterprise. New Atlantic shipping routes were developed between North America and South America, and between South America and Great Britain. Other important changes in the history of the Atlantic Ocean were caused by the movements of American and British population. After the United States became independent, there were still some people there with British sympathies. These people, who were called United Empire Loyalists, moved north from the States to the American colonies that had remained British. Some went overland to the wild country of the St. Lawrence above Quebec and founded Upper Canada. Some went by water to Nova Scotia. Others went by land or by water to the French-speaking British colony of Quebec or Lower Canada. Thus, modern Canada came into being. After the Napoleonic Wars, there was a great wave of emigration from Great Britain. Emigrants went from Scotland, Ireland, and England to all parts of Canada and to the United States. And in the States, new emigrants and old settlers moved westward together in a steady stream of pioneers to the undeveloped wilderness of the West. So Canada and the United States were opened up. British emigrants went even further afield, and going southwest, some crossed the Atlantic to the South American states. Here the southern spaces of the continent were slowly filled, and English, Scotch, Irish, and Welshmen were among those who went, and all over the continent new land was brought under cultivation. Other British emigrants went southeast to Cape Colony. Here, side by side with the Dutch farmers already there, they opened up undiscovered lands. But in this new Atlantic community of nations, the slave trade, still circulating between West Africa, the West Indies, South America, and south of the United States, was an evil survival of the 18th century. In 1807, British public feeling forced Parliament to prohibit this profitable trade, and gradually the other nations followed her example. First, the United States, and then the European countries. But though most of the slave trade disappeared, slavery remained. British public conscience again overcame trade considerations in 1833. Then slavery itself was abolished in the British Empire. Out of the taxpayer's pocket, £20 million were raised to buy the freedom of British slaves. The Atlantic areas affected were South Africa, where the farmers had slaves, and the West Indies with British Guiana. In the British West Indian Islands, the profitable sugar plantations had been worked by slave labor. Now the free slaves left the plantations to become independent. There was a shortage of labor and the sugar industries declined. The British sugar industry in the West Indies and British Guiana was very important, and at this time was far greater than that of Cuba or Brazil. So to keep it going, indented laborers were introduced from India and the East Indies. In this way, a new race with new traditions and new religious views came into the group of Atlantic peoples. But free labor was more expensive than slave labor. As a result, the sugar industries of Cuba and Brazil flourished, while British trade declined. Sugar raised by slave labor undercut British West Indian sugar in European markets. British West Indian trade declined, and the British ports of Bristol and Liverpool found themselves with far fewer imports. The British paid for the abolition of slavery in hard cash. The financial hardship was also felt here, in South Africa, by Dutch farmers whose slaves had been set free and who could not hire labor. At this time, the Zulus on the east coast attacked the Kaffir tribes who lived between them and the Dutch and drove the Kaffirs onto the Cape frontiers. Their land behind was left devastated. Some of the Dutch who wished to leave the Cape trekked into these empty lands, and some went northwards across the Vaal River. But the British annexed the port of Natal and the land behind it. Some of the Dutch then trekked back over the mountains to the unoccupied High Veld. Some settled between the Orange and Vaal rivers, some across the Vaal. Once more wild land was cultivated. The northern Dutch settlement was the independent Republic of the Transvaal from the beginning. But the south settlement was first annexed by the British and then recognized independent as the Orange Free State. So the great unproductive stretches of South Africa became farming land, chiefly devoted to cattle raising. But while this was happening, new developments were transforming life around the Atlantic. The Industrial Revolution had led to the rapid growth of factories in Europe. These factories produced manufactured goods. The workers in the factories needed food and raw materials which were being produced in the newly developed lands around the Atlantic. And farmers in the new countries needed manufactured goods. So each side of the ocean became more dependent on the other. And the invention of steamboats, independent of wind and currents, drew them together. The first Atlantic steamer route went from England to Quebec, Halifax, and New York. On the American continent, railways carried immigrants from Europe and the pioneers from the East Coast over the mountains toward the west. Steamboats carried these adventurers up the American rivers. Stagecoaches took some of them further into the interior. So the Atlantic peoples pressed over to the Pacific coast. The United States expanded to California and to the far west. At the very moment the United States of America acquired California, gold was discovered there. For a time, the rush to the gold fields dominated the Atlantic, for gold was also discovered in Australia. The rush to the gold fields led to more emigration, chiefly British, and more lines of steam transport were developed to carry these immigrants across the Atlantic and round the world. Two important routes, however, have been used by fast-sailing clippers up to the present day. The China clipper route round the Cape of Good Hope and the famous grain route round Cape Horn. The spread of population to the west made the United States develop rapidly. On the north, there was a land boundary between the States and Canada. There were several boundary disputes along this line, but all were settled by peaceful discussion between the two great nations. There is no need for a single soldier or a gun along this frontier that divides two reasonable peoples. But peaceful development was interrupted in the United States themselves. Here, the North and South were divided on the question of slavery. The states of the South were slave states, and the states of the North were against slavery. The dispute led to the outbreak of civil war. The northern states sent ships to blockade the southern ports and to prevent the export of cotton, which had been raised by slave labor. Most of the cotton was exported to England, so this blockade was felt on the other side of the Atlantic. Over here in Lancashire, huge factories had been built to manufacture American raw cotton. The blockade cut off the people of Lancashire from their raw materials. The factories closed down, unemployment and distress followed. Already so closely linked were the Atlantic peoples that upheaval on one side of the ocean caused upheaval on the other. But in 1865, the war ended. The blockade was lifted and slavery was gone forever. In the peace that followed, the United States at once resumed their westward development. The new farming lands of the Middle West were great grain-growing areas, and the far west produced fruit. The Union Pacific Railroad was now built from Omaha to the Pacific and united the west and middle west of the Atlantic coast. But to the north, the Canadian wheatlands were less fortunate. The St. Lawrence was closed in winter by ice. To get the grain to the coast in winter months, they had to send it by the United States Railway and pay heavy freightage. Partly to meet these difficulties of transport and communication, the Canadian colonies decided upon federation in 1864, and federation was achieved in 1867. In this year, Quebec and Ontario and Nova Scotia and New Brunswick formed the Dominion of Canada and were joined later by British Columbia in the far west. The Dominion took over all the vast unsettled territories of Canada and later divided them into provinces. In 1879, the Canadian Pacific Railway was begun to join British Columbia to the Atlantic coast. Now the rich farming lands of Canada could be opened up. Wheatlands, cattle country, dairy country. The Dominion, too, had great wealth in fish and furs. Fruit growing also flourished. The vast natural resources of North America lay at the service of mankind. But while the east of America is an Atlantic country, the west looks to the Pacific Ocean. Over here, the United States had in 1867 bought Alaska from Russia. There was a grave disagreement over the Alaskan frontier with the new Dominion of Canada, but this dispute was settled by arbitration. Although Canada separates Alaska from its mother country, there are no difficulties in communication and the frontiers have no need to be fortified. While the west of the Atlantic had been developing its waste places, the same thing had been happening in the eastern Atlantic coasts in Africa. In 1800, Africa had still been the dark continent, unknown and unexplored. Efforts by the British Navy to stop the slave trade led to the exploration of much of the coast and its rivers. By 1850, slave traders had been driven south of the equator, and the coastline was known. In 1865, after the American abolition of slavery, the shadow of slavery disappeared at last from the Atlantic. Now came the great period of African discovery. First came the journeys of Livingstone on the Zambezi. Then came the expeditions of Stanley in the Congo Basin. gradually the Atlantic coast of the Dark Continent became known. The French now extended their influence south and west from Senegal. Most of the Atlantic nations had colonies on the African coast, and what was left was eagerly sought after, and soon the whole of Africa was opened up. In 1883 and 1884, Germany acquired 3 colonies, marked in irregular hatching. France took over the French Congo above the Portuguese territory, and the King of the Belgians obtained supreme influence over the Belgian Congo. During these events, British South Africa and the Dutch republics had remained relatively unimportant. But the discovery of gold and diamonds about 1880 turned man's eyes to the south of the continent. There was a rush of British emigration to the gold and diamond fields, and railways were built to carry the emigrants to their gold. As a result, British influence spread north into Rhodesia, between the Dutch and the Germans. But many British immigrants had settled in the gold fields of the Transvaal, and their presence led to difficulties and friction between the Dutch and the British, which resulted in the South African War. After this war, the Dutch republics were in the British Empire, and in 1909 formed with Cape Colony and Natal the Union of South Africa. After 1918, the Union assumed a mandate over German Southwest Africa, and the other German colonies were mandated to Great Britain, France, and Belgium. Thus, the Dark Continent on the east of the Atlantic had been opened up, and the wilderness that was Africa just over 100 years ago now produces raw materials of all kinds, including cotton, cocoa, tobacco, vegetable oil, metals, cattle, and sheep. It is the west side of Africa that is an Atlantic land. Many nations have worked together in the last 100 years to develop the natural riches of the lands about this ocean. Round it have developed parts of the British Empire. The United States of America. Part of the French Empire. The Belgian Empire. Part of the Portuguese Empire. Part of the Dutch Empire. And the independent American republics. During the past 100 years, vast lands have been peacefully developed and made to add to the wealth of raw materials at the service of mankind. Wheat, cattle, dairy produce, fish, wines, cotton, coffee, cocoa, sugar, rubber, vegetable oils, metals, manufactured goods, all are now produced in the Atlantic countries and are exchanged across the ocean. Eastern and western shores have been drawn closely together by scientific discoveries that make communication easy. In 1815, it took 25 days to cross in a sailing ship. In 1940, 4.5 days by a quick liner, while it takes under a second to speak from one side of the ocean to the other by wireless. Ceaselessly, the good things of the earth have crossed from west to east and east to west. Innumerable sea and air routes draw the coast of the Atlantic Ocean together. In this great peaceful development of the Atlantic, British seamen and statesmen and traders have led the way in a community where the wilderness has been made to blossom. Human beings are free, and problems are settled by arbitration. What comes next?